To understand the development and ultimate creation of the DS, we need to talk about a lesser-known individual within Nintendo, one who would ultimately influence every handheld Nintendo console starting with the Game & Watch. Satoru Okada was born on January 10, 1947, in Odate, a town in the northern part of Japan nestled in the Akita region. When he was 5 years old, however, his family moved across the country down to Kansai, where his parents were originally from. As he grew up, Okada began working on electronics as a child, buying his own soldering equipment, tinkering with radios, and more. He would travel to Denki no Machi, a place famous for its consumer electronics stores, to spend his well-earned allowance on equipment to feed his tinkering hobby. Though he enjoyed what could be classified as a nerdy hobby, Okada was somewhat of a nonconformist. Riding his motorcycle to school, growing out his hair, finding out through the school handbook that he was allowed to wear brown instead of the black that the other school kids wore, all of these in an attempt to stand out. Okada didn't really want to cause trouble, but he, quote, enjoyed being different, end quote, mainly just having an oppositional defiant attitude, with his thought process being, why must I do the same thing as everyone else? By the time he entered college at Kansai University in Kyoto, he had been messing with radios and vacuum tubes for a while and had become part of a research lab that delved further into that technology, right as things were beginning to move towards transistors. Though Okada was skilled enough to go somewhere in Tokyo, he didn't want to move away from home, though he also admitted he accepted the first place that had given him an offer. In 1969, his research director advised him to apply to a prestigious and important electronics company in the Osaka area, Matsuo Denki. With no backup plan, Okada got chewed out by his director after he failed the application process and was subsequently rejected. After being denied a role at Matsuo Denki, a friend of his asked him to go interview at Nintendo. His friend had actually recently applied, but just wasn't interested anymore, and instead of just ghosting them, he thought it would be best to replace the candidate. So Okada went instead, and he got the job starting in April 1969. Becoming the first electrical engineer at Nintendo, word got around fast that somebody good at soldering had joined the company. You see, Nintendo's entrance exam at the time included a section where you had to physically engineer something and build it with small metal pieces. Having done similar work since he was in junior high, Okada blew right through it, helping his chances, but also giving Nintendo the opportunity to invest in a good employee. Okada's first job? N&B blocks. Having just joined as Nintendo's first electrical engineer, Okada was tasked with creating new designs for Nintendo's version of Lego blocks. Was I disappointed when I was asked to design new N&B block models? No, because I didn't even know what I was going to do anyway. I could very well have been sent as a maintenance guy for the production lines in one of their factories. Okada worked directly with Gunpei Yokoi to build huge N&B brick dioramas to display in stores. Working closely with Yokoi, Okada would work on other projects through the 70s, including an optoelectric gun titled Kosenju SP, a light telephone that used light to transmit sound, laser clay shooting, a light gun simulation, and even Nintendo's remote-controlled vacuum, Chiritori. Due to the oil crisis of 1973, however, the laser clay shooting that he and Yokoi had been intimately involved with nearly bankrupted Nintendo. Hiroshi Yamauchi even approached the pair saying, "We need money, but in order for banks to lend us some, we need to show them that we have some fun new projects to launch." So, in a very Nintendo way, Yokoi and Okada took what they created in laser clay shooting and created the Wild Gunman electromagnetic light gun arcade game, which was released in 1974. Even though Wild Gunman was a success for Nintendo's R&D1 department, they weren't able to come up with much success after that. Chiritori released in 1971 and was R&D1's biggest failure. By the time Chiritori came and went, R&D1 was in dire straits, but thankfully Yokoi came up with his big hit, the Game & Watch. Okada helped design the Game & Watch games with Yokoi, which ended up being big hits for Nintendo. After that success, combined with other games like Donkey Kong, which released in 1981, Nintendo started to lean more and more heavily into video games. With the Famicom releasing a few years later in 1983, Okada had his hands in designing games such as Donkey Kong Jr., Donkey Kong 3, Kid Icarus, Metroid, and even Rob the Robot. When the time came around to create something new for Nintendo, Yokoi and Okada began working on the Game Boy. Eventually though, Okada became the true lead of the project. While Yokoi initially set out to create a system similar to the Game & Watch, focusing on the ability to play small, quick games like Ball or Oil Panic, Okada wanted to push the console further and make something more like the Famicom, but in the palm of your hands. Since Okada was the assistant director of R&D 1, his voice was very important, but Yokoi just didn't see the point in making a system like that. Being the stubborn man he is, Okada wore Yokoi down so much that Yokoi eventually gave in and said, "Okay, do what you want." In response, Okada asked him if this meant he was being given full responsibility for the system, to which Yokoi simply replied, "Yes." To quote Okada, "The hardware was good enough to offer a wide range of games, and we were able to welcome third-party editors with a real development kit, instruction booklets, some real support, etc. And without Okada's vision of a handheld system that functioned similarly to how the Famicom functioned, the handheld console industry could have been unrecognizable to what we have today." Yokoi went on to leave Nintendo in 1996 following the release of the Virtual Boy, and Okada became the director of technical development at Nintendo, leaving R&D 1 behind. Okada continued to oversee Nintendo's handhelds, having supervised the creation and release of the Game Boy Advance and the Game Boy SP. He would also oversee the adoption of new technologies within Nintendo, including email, a networked telephone system allowing employees to call each other within the company, even developing a system that allowed a digital version of HR and admin documents. Okada even helped launch the Nintendo website in 1997, with the help of Nintendo's PR manager. After helping create the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Pocket, it was finally time to develop and release a new Game Boy, the Game Boy Advance. When it came time to create a new Nintendo system after the release of the SP, Okada went for another iteration of the Game Boy, with the system being codenamed Iris. Iris was chosen because, in Okada's words, "For us it was the 5th generation of Game Boy, so we chose the symbol of May, the 5th month in the year." In the Hanafunda playing cards, the month of May is symbolized by the iris flower. The Nintendo Iris was likely in development soon after the launch of the Game Boy Advance, with some overlap with the other revision of the Game Boy Advance, the Advance SP.
The Nintendo DS started as a single-screen handheld called the Nintendo Iris at the time. It was kind of that traditional, here's the next thing from Nintendo, from everything that we've been able to see from that. Somewhere along the line, and there's rumors as to who is the one that decided, let's do 2 screens, that evolved.
Prior to Iris development though, Okada was still trying to come up with new ways to increase the capabilities of the Game Boy Advance, creating a prototype for what would become the Game Boy Advance SP. Much like Okada's other forays into new technology, the idea of a rechargeable battery in something like the Game Boy Advance was seen as a huge money sink. Not backing down from the challenge, he and his team came up with a clamshell design, and upon showing this new prototype, Okada convinced the higher-ups to greenlight the new console. Although the SP isn't an upgrade in terms of specifications, it did well, and Okada and Nintendo started to look to the future of their handheld division. Now, according to Hiroshi Yamauchi, who at the time was serving as Nintendo's advisor, having stepped down from the role of CEO in 2002, Yamauchi told Nikkei Business Daily in 2004 that he had come up with an idea for a 2-screen handheld around mid-2002. With a prototype that we'll show in a little bit and some code that was included in the infamous GigaLeak, we know that the Iris was in development until at least 2004, with a new API for ROM access planned for release in February of 2004. In this same interview archived via GameOnline.jp and The Wayback Machine, Satoru Iwata, then president of Nintendo, claimed that, "Unlike other companies, we do not make half-baked machines that are not clearly intended for sale," and that he didn't believe a more powerful machine was the answer in terms of next-generation hardware. While the Iris was still in development, Satoru Iwata approached Okada and said he got a call from Yamauchi stating, "I talked to Yamauchi-san over the phone, and he thinks your console should have 2 screens, a bit like the multi-screen Game & Watch, you see?" According to Okada, everyone on the team, including Iwata, didn't like the idea of 2 screens, even if it was a neat callback to a previous Nintendo console. The original Game & Watch console focused on using LCD screens to not only display the time, but also play short micro games, like I discussed in one of my previous videos. The main benefit to the dual screen for the Game & Watch was it could double the screen space while being effectively cheap. A game such as Donkey Kong was ideal for a game that needed more vertical space as compared to horizontal space, and it allowed the developers to physically add more graphical components to the game. Screen technology had come a long way by the early 2000s, especially for handhelds, and it was fairly cheap to produce a screen like the Game Boy Advances for a reasonable price. Developers for the games got to decide how exactly to utilize the screen space for each game as well. So in theory, you could fit all of Donkey Kong's 25M screen into the Game Boy Advance, like shown here. Okada would elaborate on this, saying, "We were free to choose the size of our screen, so why bother splitting it into two? Especially considering that it was impossible to look at both screens at the same time. This is why we did not understand his idea." Okada is not one to simply give in to requests, as was the case with the Yokoi and the original Game Boy. So Okada pushed back against this, arguing with Iwata that it was simply a bad idea. Unlike many people in the company, I was not afraid of Yamauchi-san. I had already fought with him over different issues, and I also sometimes publicly opposed his ideas. But Iwata turned me down and said, "No, we will give it a try. See what you can do with it." We were both bothered by this, especially since it meant that we had to start all over with our project. So I tried to put my team at ease and I told them, "I have some experience working with double screens, we will give it a best shot, and we'll see. Don't worry." It then became Project Nitro. Project Nitro would be the final codename for the Nintendo DS, and the switch from the Nintendo Iris to the Nintendo DS did in fact come very late in the Iris's development.
In the early days of Nitro, which was Nintendo DS, it was actually an upgrade to the Nintendo Iris development kit, where they transitioned the name from Iris to Nitro. So it's all of that same family. They were already thinking about, the Game Boy, what would be next. 3D seemed logical. And then the two screens came along, but there's a lot of overlapping history there that I think is overlooked by many people. I don't think you get the DS without the work that was going into Iris.
While the project was still called Nintendo Iris, a few early prototypes do remain, namely the Iris TEG-01 board. This board is a prototype console in its most bare-bones form. The hardware itself, shown off thanks to YouTuber Mystery Console, has a handbook dated November 21st, 2003. With this dated version of the development hardware, we can see it only has one screen, has the name Iris TEG-01, and has all the same buttons as the Game Boy Advance systems, except with a few extras, including debug, reset, and EX and EY. The documentation that's included with the Iris TEG-01, along with files included in the infamous GigaLeak, includes information that alludes to an Iris emulator and Iris SDKs or software development kits. It's important to note that according to this manual, this Iris TEG board was made so that anything developed with the Iris CGB emulator could be tested on prototype hardware, with the Iris emulator, named Eris, and early prototype hardware being available to some third-party developers, as well as an IS Iris SDK being named. Development was pretty far along on the Iris handheld by the time it switches to codenamed Nitro.
As you look at the software development kit for the Nintendo DS, the emulator that they built in for the SDK early on was named Insada, which is named after the Iris Insada flower. So you can see right there, even as they transitioned to Nitro, there were a lot of Iris leftovers throughout there.
While Yamauchi may have come up with the idea for a two-screen handheld in 2002, with the original idea dating back to the release of Donkey Kong Game & Watch in 1982, it appears the development team behind the Iris did not take the idea seriously until 2004, the year the console would officially launch. Prior to that, there are at least 3 known Iris development kits titled Iris SDK Snapshots, with 2 being released in December and 1 being released in January. While the main concern of the development team was that they were going to have to change everything to accommodate this second screen, based on the natural evolution of the SDKs and information within these development kits, it appears the hardware used to run the Nintendo DS did not change all that much. The idea behind the Nintendo DS, and before that the Nintendo Iris, was to create a handheld system that was capable of 3D effects, namely to continue to compete with the competition that was coming out. Demos that were included with this SDK did in fact have native 3D capabilities, meaning the Iris wasn't simply a different version of the Game Boy Advance, but had upgraded hardware that would eventually become the Nitro. In fact, within the files for Insada, the Nintendo DS emulator created for development for the DS, there's an entire folder titled Iris, and just about every single directory points back to Iris to run the emulator itself. One can even run Iris software through the Insada emulator, with the software only displaying on the bottom screen. With the SDKs using previous Game Boy Advance hardware for development purposes, and the finalized hardware being similar to the Game Boy Advance, the Iris does appear to be a simple upgrade from the original Game Boy Advance that was eventually pushed into a different direction.
But I think the Game Boy successor DS they're not really separate things. They are, in many ways, one and the same.
Thus, with only a few months from E3 2004, the event in which Nintendo intended to announce the Game Boy Advance's successor, the team began to work on what we would know as the Nintendo DS. Prior to E3 2004, Nintendo stated in a meeting held on Thursday, November 13th, 2003, that they had posted a loss in the beginning half of the fiscal year. Nintendo detailed more of their philosophies and plans for their future in the industry, and announced that they were planning to release a new game product that would not be a successor to the GameCube or the Game Boy Advance in 2004. Nothing else was stated in this meeting regarding the new product, however. A couple months later, in January, and just a few months before E3, then Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Nintendo of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, would fly to Japan to have his first meetings with Satoru Iwata, Shigeru Miyamoto, and the entirety of NCL, aka Nintendo Company Limited. Having been hired in December, this was Reggie's first opportunity to meet everyone in Nintendo. But first and foremost, they had to come up with a plan for E3. Within the first few days, Reggie had a meeting with some of the top executives at Nintendo. I walked into the room and saw a prototype laid out on a large, flat motherboard with exposed chips and soldering. At the center were the defining two screens of the system. The excitement in the room was palpable, and the hair on the back of my neck stood. The prototype was fully functional, and the developer showed us a variety of different games. This was the Nintendo DS. Reggie Fils-Aimé disrupting the game. Joined by Don James, who was serving as the Executive VP of Operations for Nintendo of America, both were the only non-Japanese executives in the room, and had to have their comments on the Nintendo DS's impressive technology translated each time they spoke. They discussed the touchscreen, how it would enable new ways to play games, and how this new feature would be a major differentiation for Nintendo. We will need to feature this in our consumer communication. What games make best use of the touchscreens? Reggie would ask. While the team behind the device would describe a new Metroid game and a new Mario game, the game they were most excited about was all about interacting with virtual dogs via the touchscreen and built-in microphone. We need to fully leverage the touchscreen. We may need to make this a key message at E3 and paint a vision for the new experiences the Nintendo developers will be able to create, Reggie said. Shigeru Miyamoto, who had only recently arrived at the meeting, joined in, saying, "He is right. The touchscreen needs to be a major focus for us, and we need to work hard on the experiences we plan to showcase at E3 and demonstrate how we will create brand new games for consumers using all of the capabilities of our new system." Only a few weeks later, on January 20th, 2004, Nintendo announced their new product, the Nintendo DS. According to Yahoo Finance, players will no longer be forced to interrupt gameplay to shift perspective, such as moving from a wide shot to a close-up, or alternating between a character's ongoing battle and a map of the environment. Nintendo DS makes it possible to perform the tasks in real time by simply glancing from one screen to another. And Satoru Iwata gave a quote stating, "We have developed Nintendo DS based upon a completely different concept from existing game devices in order to provide players with a unique entertainment experience of the 21st century." The announcement came with some specifications, including the fact that the DS featured two 3-inch TFT LCD panels, two different processors, and semiconductor memory of up to 1 gigabit. However, the device itself was not shown off at all. What's interesting to note here is the quick advancement that the DS had. Given the official development tools and the manual for the Iris SDK, we know that the Iris was still the primary console for Nintendo until at least December, which makes the announcement of the new gaming product on November 13th very interesting, especially considering that the Iris SDK manual included a date of December 3rd for that specific SDK build. Reggie visited Kyoto to meet with NCL in January, however, and Nintendo of America even announced the DS in late January, specifically the 20th. So sometime between the November 13th announcement and that meeting with NCL in January, the Iris officially became the DS. While the hardware remained very similar, the introduction of the second screen really changed a lot of what Reggie, Miyamoto, and many others thought about the console. Finally, on May 12, 2004, Nintendo held their E3 2004 press conference. They showed off a highlight reel of GameCube and Game Boy Advance games, ending with, "We make games that make games worth playing." And Reggie got on stage, stating his now famous tagline,
"My name is Reggie, I'm about kicking ass, I'm about taking names, and we're about making games."
After a riveting opening, Reggie and George Harrison talked about the games hitting the GameCube, the Game Boy, and the sales of both consoles. Once Reggie took the stage again, he talked about the future and what Nintendo's next step was. An on-street interview-style video of people in a GameStop played, showing excited individuals who couldn't wait for the dual screen. Reggie walked back on stage and simply said,
"Well, the wait is over. This is Nintendo DS."
before showing off a prototype console in all its silver and black glory. Reggie talked about the DS moniker, saying that to Nintendo, it wasn't the dual screen, it was the developer system. Reggie hit on the notes that this was the future of development and the future of Nintendo, and asked all those in attendance to, quote, listen to the experts, aka the developers, before showing off another video all about the DS itself. This video included executives from Activision, Namco, Vivendi, Square Enix, and more, with the president of Square Enix saying, "It has been a long time since the mobile platform has changed radically." Reggie went on to announce more information on the console itself, including that each screen was programmable for either 2D or 3D, which led him to show off the 3D capabilities with an early version of Mario 64 DS. While Reggie focused on the fact that developers had a choice in how they would make these games, he gave use cases such as having two different perspectives of a battle, or a character standing 2 screens high, or even a constant map. A new 3D Metroid was shown off, with the crowd going wild with the idea of being able to test it on the E3 show floor.
Same way you'll be playing it tomorrow.
A similarly huge announcement was that the DS would be backwards compatible, with
2 media bays.
allowing players to play DS games and Game Boy Advance games. The announcement of the touchscreen and built-in microphone, highlighting 2 new ways to play games besides the tried-and-true controller method, was announced, along with the wireless capabilities, one being proprietary, allowing for up to 16 people on a local network, and finally Wi-Fi capabilities. Another video highlighting executives such as THQ, EA, Sega with an appearance by Yuji Naka, Tsunekazu Ishihara from the Pokemon Company, Keiji Inafune from Capcom, and more, all talked about the touchscreen features, the local wireless features, the new cartridge format, the new 3D capabilities, and more. All in a bet to sell developers and players on this new, futuristic-looking console. By the end of Reggie's presentation, he announced a launch window of 2004, and specifically stated that it would be at a competitive price point. Iwata then took the stage and definitively stated that they were most proud of the DS, above all of their previous innovations, stating,
It is different.
Iwata would then go on to tease a new Nintendo console, highlighting Nintendo's approach not only to the DS, but their future consoles, by saying,
Simply beefing up those graphics will not let most of us see a difference. For both game creators and game players, new machine needs to do much more. They must offer an unprecedented play experience, something no other machine has delivered before.
By then, a folding console wasn't necessarily unique. I had heard about Game & Watches, even though we didn't really have many around at that point. Seeing Super Mario 64 running on a handheld was almost impossible to even comprehend at the time. But I think looking at the console itself, Nintendo didn't do the best job of justifying 2 screens from the start, and a lot of that comes out of the development history of the platform itself. But I think as time went on, even just moving past E3 to launch, you start to see, oh, there's something here.
I've been playing video games ever since I was a little kid. I remember having a Game & Watch as my first handheld. It was my first console, if you want to call it that. But I had a Game & Watch in the early 1980s. I was reading video game magazines and keeping up to date with various gaming websites. So I saw it and I thought it was really interesting. But again, since I had this notion of the handhelds from Nintendo were mostly for kids games, because that's what a lot of the ads were. I saw it and I was like, that's cool. I would love to see what it looks like later, but I didn't go out seeking it when it came out.
Nintendo held their booth right beside Sony's in the West Hall of the Los Angeles Convention Center to the right side of the entrance. With Sony announcing the PlayStation Portable that same E3, it was a clash of the handhelds. On Nintendo's side, games such as Paper Mario 2, which would later be known as Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, Tales of Symphonia, and more were available for GameCube. while Metroid Prime Hunters, WarioWare Inc. DS, New Super Mario Bros., Mario Kart DS, PictoChat, and a version of Animal Crossing were all playable for the DS. Nintendo had originally referred to the DS as their third pillar, and was not meant to disrupt the sales of the GameCube, or more specifically, the Game Boy, which was also a handheld.
I think the third pillar idea was partially a safe choice, but I think there's actually other reasons that add to why they approached this from the third pillar. One was the fact that the GBA wasn't that old. It had only just released in 2001. So now we're talking 2004 when the DS came out. That's not a lot of room there. So from a let's support a platform that, tens of millions of people have invested in, that part just makes sense from a business point of view. There's this platform that's out there, has certain specs. It's not going to be as cutting edge as the DS would be with 3D graphics. So why not support that? I think it just makes sense. I also think it benefits developers as well. One, there are many GBA games already in development. You don't want to just leave them high and dry because you have something new coming out so soon. Especially when you compare it to, say, GBA to the original Game Boy, and I know there's the Game Boy Color in between, but I think they're conscious of things like the Virtual Boy and the Game Boy Color. How do we, support developers and make sure that they can make games for the GBA or for the DS? So from a business point of view, I think it was really important to have some support, and we saw that with the release of the Game Boy Micro in 2005. Nintendo was committed to some level of supporting GBA. Plus, with backwards compatibility in the DS, why not continue to support that? What's not clear through all of that is what the expectations actually were for both Nintendo and for how they would have had consumers perceive that. Like you, it'd be easy to say, it's a third pillar, but let's just see how the DS goes. If the DS had failed, which was always a possibility, Nintendo would have done what Nintendo does best and come up with something else that was new and creative and unique. And I'm sure by then they also knew that the PSP was coming, which would just be a high-power handheld system. So that shouldn't be forgotten either, especially if you look at media at the time. They were pretty down on the DS compared to the PSP with its cutting-edge graphics and sleek design, versus a toy that the Nintendo DS, particularly that first model, looked like.
While the revealing of the DS was a success, Reggie recounted that, "We received harsh feedback on the prototype DS units we showed at E3. People perceived the design to be clunky and cheap. The screens were described as small and the images weren't crisp. The criticism was especially tough because a prototype of the PSP was also at E3 2004. Their unit was essentially one large screen and looked beautiful. It didn't matter that the screen would be covered in fingerprints or potentially crack in the real world. In the enclosed space of E3, attendees would handle the unit for a minute and then gingerly hand it back to a Sony representative, who would then immediately wipe it down to remove fingerprints." Highlighting a key issue for the DS, it didn't look or feel sexy, like the competition across the aisle. Along with the looks, the software itself was judged harshly according to Reggie, who says, "While we had described the Nintendo DS software as proof of concept demos, booth attendees were evaluating them as full-fledged games. We had to reinforce the point that these were only examples of what could be done with a game. Most of the media understood our messaging, but many others did not and complained aggressively."
I think that the dual screen idea with the touch screen built into the bottom wasn't quite fully comprehended by developers at that point. So to the fan, and I bought a DS on day one, I lined up at GameStop to buy one, it wasn't really clear what the capability would be. So in some ways, it certainly was a gimmick at the start. It's eye-catching, it's unique, there's nothing that looks quite like it. But within that first year, Nintendo completely justified its existence, and I don't think there's any doubt anymore as to why two screens was the way that they chose to go.
The touchscreen, I was a little bit iffy on, because I had seen other touchscreens not being as responsive. You needed to, they were usually used for hands, not for the little stylus. So the touchscreens that I had the privilege or the pleasure of using was not fun at all because they were usually slow, they had terrible resolution, and they were just not fun to interact with.
Before any more information came out regarding the DS, a document containing the specifications of the console were leaked, including the internal development name, which some misconstrued as its final title, the Nitro. The leaked specs are as follows: 4 megabytes of RAM, dual processors, 656 kilobytes video RAM, touch-sensitive screen, 256 by 192 pixels per screen, 120,000 polygons per second, 802.11b wireless networking. While some of this would become known at E3, the specific poly count, RAM numbers, and the touch-sensitive screen were new. The dual processors were also confirmed to both be ARM processors, one ARM7 and one ARM9, with the article concluding that the ARM7 was most likely to be used for the DS's backwards compatibility. By July of 2004, Nintendo unveiled their new version of the Nintendo DS, receiving a facelift in terms of the overall design. Changes include a thinner base, an angular top, large shoulder and face buttons, some changes in button placement, a storage slot for the included stylus, and stereo speakers. The USA Today article includes quotes from both Iwata and Reggie saying, "The Nintendo DS will change the future of handheld gaming. Dual screens, chat functions, a touchscreen, wireless capability, voice recognition, these abilities surpass anything attempted before, and consumers will benefit from the creativity and innovation the new features bring to the world of video games." And the innovative functions make Nintendo DS a superior game device, while the chat feature and ability to detect other DS units make it a social device as well. We've figured out the magic of what makes portable gameplay so attractive to consumers. We've defeated 9 challengers, and once again, we're prepared to win. In this article, USA Today states that over 120 games were in development for the DS, with over 20 of those attributed to Nintendo. From July to September, Reggie was behind the scenes at Nintendo of America getting the DS ready for its launch. Reggie, along with all of NOA, was in a battle with Iwata and the rest of NCL. Reggie was putting together a set of plans, all of which would break precedent away from every other console launch that Nintendo has done. The plan? Launch the DS in the Americas first, preferably before Black Friday, to leverage one of the largest shopping days in the year. To do this, the US needed the largest allocation of units compared to the other regions. The idea behind all of this was simple, and it was a message that Reggie was able to get through to Iwata. If Nintendo wanted the DS to be a global success, it first needed to be a success in the Americas. Reggie had pulled everyone together to review the launch plans, which included a tactic that rewarded more aggressive marketing activity from retailers, allocating more launch inventory to those retailers who truly believed in making the DS a success. The other part was getting a launch title ready. Reggie pushed the development team of Metroid Prime Hunters to launch the game with the DS in North America, since Metroid Prime was a pretty big success in the United States, and Prime Hunters highlighted 2 of the main features of the Nintendo DS, online connectivity and the touchscreen. Hunters just was not as far as they had hoped, however. So instead, Reggie had the development team pivot to create a demo for Hunters titled Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt, which would be included with the DS. With the change in launch plans and wanting to include free software, both of these shakeups by Reggie were not very popular with NCL, but the trust he had built with Iwata and Miyamoto allowed the demo to be developed and launched with the Nintendo DS in North America. Then, on September 21, 2004, IGN reported that the Nintendo DS would launch on November 21st for a price of $149.99. The $149.99 was estimated by many in the industry prior to any official announcement, and the fact that it was only $50 more than the Game Boy Advance while having 2 screens and upgraded hardware overall seemed to be a steal. The report by IGN included that over 100 companies signed on to develop the system, and the fact that Nintendo chose the US because of the overwhelmingly positive and enthusiastic reaction from customers, and to take advantage of the holiday sales season. Satoru Iwata is quoted in the article stating, "Nintendo's mission remains unchanged. Expand the game experience. Nintendo DS is the roadmap to the future of video games, and most clearly demonstrates the type of innovation that players demand." With a launch date set, all that was left was for Nintendo to release the future of handheld gaming. Official pre-orders for the DS went up on November 3rd, 2004, mere weeks before the DS was set to release. By November 4th of 2004, GameStop had already halted its pre-orders, citing the fact that they had already sold through all of their stock. In an article by GamesIndustry.biz, EB Games, one of GameStop's primary competitors in the 2000s, hadn't stopped pre-orders yet, but did warn that they were likely going to soon enough due to the high demand of the system. Less than 2 weeks later, on November 15th, Gizmodo reported that pre-orders of the new handheld had already hit 2 million, with Nikkei Journal being the original source. CNET also reported on the pre-orders, stating that Nintendo had planned to produce only 1 million units for launch, and due to the much higher demand than Nintendo expected, they would end up bringing a third production factory online to keep up. These pre-order amounts do, of course, include Japanese pre-orders, and since the console would release in Japan on December 2nd, Nintendo had to make sure they had enough for both sides of the Pacific. Due to demand, Nintendo raised its sales forecast from 3.5 million to 4 million by the end of the fiscal year, and saw their stock rise in Japan by 3.8% the day it was announced that they had too many pre-orders. With the focus on launching in the US first, Nintendo even shifted the amounts that each country would launch with, meaning the United States got around 500,000 units at launch, and Japan had around 300,000 units at launch, basically flipping the norm around. Using the tagline, "Touching is good," aimed at teens and young adults, Nintendo's marketing was aggressive and showed a lingering of the GameCube and Game Boy Advance's more edgy marketing as well, a true reflection of the early 2000s.
It's hard for me to forget some of the early advertising for the Nintendo DS. They shipped out mannequin hands as part of the advertising campaign, so I'm sure I still have mine in storage somewhere. It was always a conversation starter. Why do you have a mannequin hand on a shelf? You know, it's something that I don't think Nintendo would have advertised nowadays. The idea of touching is good. That was one of the catchphrases for the DS. It's hard to forget that.
Finally, on November 21st, 2004, the Nintendo DS officially hit store shelves in North America. Nintendo ended up holding a DS launch party in Los Angeles at the Universal City Walk EB Games. The event started at 8 p.m. November 20th and featured a DJ, pyrotechnics, celebrity appearances, gameplay on a huge Jumbotron, and of course, a countdown to when the DS went on sale. Stores across the country also held their own midnight launch celebrations, with Nintendo choosing not to hold the DS hostage until 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Prior to launch, during their October 7th press release, Nintendo confirmed launch or near-to-launch titles for the Nintendo DS, including Asphalt Urban GT, Feel the Magic XYXX, Madden NFL 2005, Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt, Spider-Man 2, Super Mario 64 DS, and The Urbs Sims in the City. Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt was a pack-in demo users would play with, while also using PictoChat, another piece of bundled software. The Nintendo DS retailed for $149.99 in North America and 15,000 yen in Japan. In North America, the Nintendo DS came boxed with Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt, but Japan didn't get the same luxury. The console itself sits at 5.85 inches wide, 3.33 inches high, and 1.14 inches thick when closed. Opening up the console, the first thing you'll hopefully notice are the two TFT LCD screens, both with a resolution of 256 by 192 for your classic 4:3 aspect ratio, while the bottom screen is that resistive touchscreen with a little microphone as well. We have 4 main face buttons, those being A, B, X, and Y. Then we have Start, Select, Power, and of course a D-pad. On the back side, we do have 2 shoulder buttons, L and R, and a slot for you to put your stylus, the charging port, and of course the slot for a DS cartridge. On the flip side of that, we have a volume slider, a headphone jack, and a Game Boy Advance cartridge slot. Opening up the 2-screen monstrosity, the Nintendo DS runs 2 ARM processors, also known as Advanced RISC machines. RISC itself is another acronym that might be familiar to you if you happen to watch my Nintendo 64 video. Reduced Instruction Set computers run a, you guessed it, reduced instruction set. Originally intended to simplify the instructions compared to the CISC, or Complex Instruction Set computer, the goal is to offset processing more instructions by increasing the speed at which each instruction is performed. ARM processors are famous for being SoCs as compared to its CISC counterpart, x86, meaning generally the components that are separated in an x86 computer, graphics chips, memory, storage, etc., are all independent, while ARM makes it so that the processing unit is on the same physical substrate, making them much more application-specific. and when coding for them can generally take more overall lines of code, since you need to state exactly what you need to happen on these chips. The first processor is a 32-bit ARM 946ES, which serves as the main CPU. It runs at a 67 MHz clock speed and is primarily in charge of processing gameplay mechanisms and video rendering. The second processor is also a 32-bit ARM processor, this time the ARM7 TDMI, which runs at 33 MHz clock speed, and is the exact same as the processor in the Game Boy Advance, except clocked at a higher rate. Other than running Game Boy Advance games, the TDMI is in charge of sound processing and Wi-Fi support. The DS has 4 MB of PS RAM, 256 KB of serial flash memory, built-in 802.11 wireless network connection, and a rechargeable 850 mAh lithium-ion battery, which, according to Nintendo, can last around 10 hours, depending on the game, of course. The nice thing to say about the battery is it is user replaceable. So if your battery dies after several years or about 500 charges, you can always just pop a new one in there yourself and call it a day. To help save battery once you're done playing a game, instead of powering down the console via the power button, you can instead just close the console itself. This will activate the DS's sleep mode, pausing the game and saving battery life by turning off the screens, speakers, and any wireless communications. For the internals themselves, what's most interesting about the two ARM processors is the fact that they are unlike the Saturn or the PS1/N64, in that each CPU are independent computers entirely, performing exclusive operations through a dedicated bus. In its practical function, however, the ARM 946ES is the primary CPU. It's part of the ARM 9 series, the first of which was the ARM 9 TDMI, the successor to the ARM7 TDMI, which was released in 1998. The 946ES, on the other hand, released in 2000. So similar to the lateral thinking with withered technology from Yokoi and the Game & Watch days, the DS Nitro CPU was not using the absolutely latest and greatest technology. The graphics for the DS are where things can get a bit challenging, and it may be where the Nintendo Iris differed the most. While we have a basic idea that the Iris would have still used the same dual processor setup thanks to the Iris's SDK, without the second screen, it's likely that we would have had two different graphics engines within the DS. The basic graphical pipeline for the DS is as follows. Each graphical engine must be linked to a screen. So, for example, the top screen is generally linked to the 3D graphic engine and can be routed to screen 1 or screen 2, depending on what the developer wants. And along with that 3D engine, there are actually two different 2D graphic engines, so technically 3 engines in total. This allows for developers to display 2D graphical information on both screens, while 3D graphics are limited to one screen at a time. The 2D engines are split between being the main engine and the sub-engine. The 3D engine itself has to be attached to whichever screen has the main engine on it. Now, these 2D engines are an enhanced version of the Nintendo's PPU, something they've been building off of since the NES, and on the DS was a technical upgrade from the GBA, allowing for bit-mapped sprites, sprite rotations, and more. One trick that developers used to sometimes render 3D on two different screens was to swap which screen had the main engine each frame, allowing for 3D effects to be shown on both screens. The 3D engine itself is also split into two engines, the geometry engine and the rendering engine. The geometry engine is focusing on rendering the vertex information, while the rendering engine does, well, everything else, including texture mapping, gold rod shading, perspective correction, alpha blending, fog, and more. The hardest thing to get around for the DS was the polygon limit. The DS itself has a hard limit of 2048 polygons. Due to the small screen and lower resolution of the DS, this was sometimes hidden, but direct comparisons can show where the DS suffers, including the omission of some features, like texture filtering, MIP mapping, and anti-aliasing. Much like the Saturn that came before it, the thought process appears to have been that if you use a combination of 2D and 3D graphics, you can achieve something really special. Not to mention, thanks to the lower power of the ARM systems used, battery life could be much better than competitors, like how the Game Boy was initially imagined. One of the most interesting features the DS had was the download play, or single card play as Nintendo would call it. This allowed for users to play multiplayer games like Mario Kart and other DS systems using a single game card. Whoever owned the game would simply start the download play functionality in the game they own, and the other would select the DS download play feature on the main menu. The guest system would download the necessary information from the host, and ta-da! You can play Mario Kart together with only one cartridge.
The joy of being able to play with others without them having a copy of the game was super innovative.
Retailers use this feature by having download stations, allowing users to download demos of DS games on their own system, and Nintendo would even release a channel for the Wii that had similar functionality. Since the DS has some memory limitations, any information downloaded via a download station or the Wii channel would be erased once the DS was powered down. As detailed by Reggie Fils-Aimé in his book, Nintendo was in for the long haul with the DS, wanting it and their in-development console codenamed Revolution to bring gaming to the masses, and strong sales upon the DS release helped that momentum. By the end of the DS era's first week on the market, which included Black Friday, the DS had sold 500,000 units, matching the amount Nintendo claimed the Game Boy Advance sold during its first week in North America. One lucky spot for Nintendo in North America was that it didn't have to compete with the PlayStation Portable, something that the DS would have to do when it launched in Japan. December 2nd, 2004, the Nintendo DS released in Japan and was met with just as much, if not more, enthusiasm than the American market, thanks in part to a marketing campaign including singer-songwriter Hikaru Utada and her song with the lyrics, "I still remember the way that you touch me," proudly used. Though on launch day, the enthusiasm did seem subdued. According to a first-hand account by IGN writer Anoop Gantayat, the Thursday the Nintendo DS launched was a regular working day and happened to be one of the coldest days of the year so far. Anoop speculated that due to these frigid conditions, even people who pre-ordered the system didn't want to go out right at 7 a.m. to get their DSs. Yasuhiro Minagawa, a spokesperson from Nintendo, told Reuters, "Sales seem to be off to a good start, despite the fact that we are launching on a weekday." The overall enthusiasm was still there though, and Nintendo ended up increasing the total amount sent to Japan from the initial 300,000 to 500,000, matching the US. According to GamesIndustry.biz, independent analysts believe the DS sold over 230,000 units within its first 24 hours on sale, which is most likely the reason why they increased the launch total to 500,000 in Japan. With Nintendo hitting their 500,000 mark in Japan by the end of the first week, Nintendo decided to raise the overall sales forecast of the Nintendo DS to 2.8 million by the end of the year. Nintendo announced this increase on December 21st, as reported by the LA Times, and stated they plan to ship an extra 800,000 units compared to the original shipment of 2 million consoles. With the DS selling incredibly well, everything was going right for Reggie, Nintendo of America, and Nintendo Company Limited, and it appeared that increasing their forecast to sell 4 million units by the end of the fiscal year to 5 million units was the correct choice. With the system launching in North America and Japan, Australians and Europeans would have to wait until 2005, with Australians getting the console on February 24th and Europeans getting it on March 11th. Both regions would have the first Hunt demo boxed in with the console, much like North America. Europe also held a small number of units that were released prior to the 11th that came with a VIP t-shirt, First Hunters, a WarioWare Touch demo, and a pre-release of Super Mario 64 DS. Players could purchase it via the Nintendo Stars catalog and was listed at $129.99 in the UK and $189.99 for the rest of Europe. Sales for the console in Europe and Australia were strong, with the Australian launch breaking sales records for a console. Later in 2005, on June 15th, the iQue DS would release in China, with games like Super Mario 64 DS, Spider-Man 2, and Asphalt Urban GT. The Nintendo DS didn't exactly have a killer lineup of launch titles, though the allure of a new way to play was enough for a lot of people, and with the DS coming with a demo packed in, you at least didn't have to immediately buy a game for it. Super Mario 64 was on its own an impressive title since they added content, included a 4-player mode, and of course, it was Super Mario 64 in the palm of your hands. But the rest of the games were considered a bit lackluster comparatively. One app that many enjoyed playing around with was PictoChat, a built-in application that allowed up to 16 people to connect with each other and chat all at once. With touchscreen drawing and typing, users could send messages whenever they wanted within their local area. The DS got Mario Kart DS, a new portable version of the game everyone's loved since the Super Nintendo, on November 14, 2005. Though this game made limited use of the touchscreen compared to other titles on the system, it did use the second screen as a map for players to use. It was one of the most well-received titles on release, and to this day is highly regarded as one of the best Mario Kart games. One of the key differences in Mario Kart DS was the inclusion of multiplayer via the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, allowing players to race against each other globally. Whether it was in the safety of your own home or at McDonald's with their free Wi-Fi. November 14th also marks the release of the Nintendo Wi-Fi Connection Service in North America, a free online service run by Nintendo, allowing players to connect to the Wi-Fi via a Wi-Fi USB connector or a wireless router. Australia, Japan, and Europe services would launch on 17th, 23rd, and 25th respectively, and Japan's compatible title ended up being Animal Crossing Wild World instead of Mario Kart. Later on, Nintendo even released a web browser for the DS, which came with a GBA cartridge expanding the RAM of the DS and a DS game card that had a version of Opera running on it. Mario Kart DS became the best-selling handheld game for the month of November, and in Japan sold 224,000 copies in its first week. After Mario Kart DS, Nintendo didn't really have any big-name games set to release, and the full version of Metroid Prime Hunters wouldn't be released until 2006. One of Nintendo's biggest hits was one of its weirdest ideas in the grand scheme of things. Nintendogs came out on April 21, 2005, and was met with rave reviews from critics everywhere. With gameplay revolving around playing with dogs, Nintendogs makes use of just about every DS capability, including the microphone to teach your dog tricks, the touchscreen to pet, clean, and play with them, the DS's wireless capabilities to connect with other DS's to play with friends, and the dogs get dirty and hungry as time progressed according to the internal clock and calendar. The game was split up into 3 different versions: Dachshund and Friends, Lab and Friends, and Chihuahua and Friends, all with different breeds. The game went on to receive a perfect 40 out of 40 score from Famitsu in Japan, while other journalists would give it a bit of a lower rating, like the 8.5 out of 10 from Nintendo Power and the 8 out of 10 from Game Informer. The Associated Press even gave the game the Best Game of 2005 award. The game saw a good first week of sales in Japan, with a total of 168,000 units, with the sales of all 3 combined. In North America, the game sold over 250,000 copies in its first week, and by GDC 2006, sales had reached 6 million copies. By the end of its run, Nintendogs would sell 23.96 million copies and ended up becoming the second best-selling game on the Nintendo DS.
The first time I actually played one was when we had my wife's relatives over one summer, and her youngest sister had a Nintendo DS. And she was playing what everyone else was playing, which is Nintendogs. So I started playing that, and I was like, this is so cool. You have 2 screens. One of them is touch. I knew this because I've read the reviews, I've watched the reveal videos and everything, but I had never tried it myself. So just sitting there playing Nintendogs with her, I believe she was 5 years old at the time, and playing that with her was really fascinating because the dual screen meant that you had way more control and you got way more information than you ever had before. Be it on a big TV or on a handheld, all of a sudden you had 2 screens giving you information. One of them also being used for input together with the D-pad and the buttons. So it's just so cool to see it all kind of blend together.
Nintendogs helped achieve Nintendo's hope of opening gaming to the masses thanks to its broad reach, with a majority of its player base being female, and the fact that Nintendo dropped the price of the DS to $129.99 a day before Nintendogs released. The next game to really push that agenda for Nintendo was Brain Age, which first released in Japan in 2005, but later made its way to North America and other regions in 2006. Further making use of the touchscreen and microphone to task players with solving puzzles while holding the DS sideways, mind you, Brain Age features Professor Kawashima, a neuroscientist and expert in brain imaging who also trained in neurophysiology. Professor Kawashima was actively involved with the development and is the host of the game. While the actual scientific effects of Brain Age are left up to a bit of a discussion, the response and sales of the game are not. Although the game received some criticism for its voice/handwriting recognition, Brain Age ended up winning Edge Magazine's Edge Award for Innovation in 2006 and was awarded Handheld Game of the Year by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences. However, the development and release had its issues. After Nintendogs release, there weren't really any other games for Nintendo to market and release, at least none that the company viewed as heavy hitters. Brain Age had also already been released in Japan by the time Reggie and Nintendo of America decided to bring it stateside, with the game focusing on an unusual audience for gaming, consumers over the age of 50. It was another push by Nintendo to get the DS in as many hands as possible. This, and the fact that they needed to fully localize the handwriting and voice recognition, meant a lot of changes and challenges were coming to Brain Age. The biggest one came from the lack of awareness for Professor Kawashima outside of Japan. Reggie spoke with Iwata to try and include additional content, like Sudoku, into the game. While they had a back and forth discussion about it, Kawashima eventually gave his overwhelming support to the idea, and Nintendo integrated it in releases outside of Japan to appeal to a broader audience. To quote Reggie, "We solved the handwriting and voice command issues, seamlessly integrated Sudoku, and launched the software in April 2006. Just as in the Japanese market, we saw initial sales that were steady, but they continued to grow month by month. More importantly, the software was associated with the purchase of new hardware. We were achieving our objective to expand the gaming universe." Brain Age would go on to sell 19.01 million units, becoming the 4th best-selling DS game of all time. With a plethora of solid games and the console selling like hotcakes, Nintendo announced a revised version of the console on January 26, 2006. Titled the DS Lite, the internals of this new console are the exact same as the original Nintendo DS, but features a brighter screen, sleeker design, and would become the default DS for many people, with this revision alone selling over 93 million units.
I mean, the DS Lite is just a perfect size. It's very sleek, very easy to carry around. The original was a lot more bulkier.
Along with the release of the DS Lite and Brain Age in 2006, one of Nintendo's biggest franchises would finally hit the dual-screen handheld on September 28, 2006. Set in the brand new Sinnoh region, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl became an immediate success. While the game was originally announced in 2004 for a 2005 release, they ended up pushing it to 2006, which ended up being the 10th year anniversary of the Pokemon franchise. With the wireless capabilities of the DS, players could trade and battle over the internet or via the local wireless connection, and the bottom screen was used as a menu of sorts. Diamond and Pearl, like the previous Pokemon games, was an immediate success and brought even more life to the DS. Of course, it wasn't the only Pokemon game on the console, with the DS getting Platinum, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Black and White, and Black and White 2. The consistent release of titles, along with a couple of revisions, helped keep the Nintendo DS near the top of the charts in terms of sales, with each quarter of the Nintendo DS Lite sales increasing by at least 4 million units, upwards of 10 million until a new revision came out. That new revision hit store shelves in the spring of 2009 for most of the world. Beginning development in late 2006, the DSi was an even slimmer version of the DS, with new functionalities and larger screens. Nintendo announced the console in October of 2008 with a slew of new features, including a camera, a slightly larger screen, 16 megabytes of memory, a higher clock speed on the ARM9, an SD card slot, wider viewing angles, and the ability to download games titled DSiWare. The DSi released in Japan on November 1st, 2008, and would hit the rest of the world in April 2009. At a retail price of $169.99, Nintendo managed to do what they set out to do by creating a slimmer DS, again. But this time they cut out GBA functionality altogether, with only a DS card slot. Then, a year later, they would release the DSi XL, a larger version of the DS that focused on having a bigger screen, though for compatibility it was still the 256 by 192 resolution. One of the big ideas with the DSi was the personalization of the console. There were many different colors upon release, and within the system itself you had ways to personalize it. Satoru Iwata shared that this was to encourage families to buy their own individual handheld, kind of like the idea that if mom kept borrowing the DS to play Brain Age, well, she might as well get her own. This is also representative in the naming scheme. The eye symbolizes the individual and cameras, aka the eyes. To quote Reggie, "If Wii was about gaming for the masses, then think of DSi as creativity for the masses." The release of the DSi helped continue the DS's longevity and strong sales, with sales starting off really strong for a new revision of a console that was 5 years old at this point.
I think the revisions to the consoles provides many benefits. One is it's just another touch point of, oh, there's this new thing in stores that people can go out and buy. It was something that they had done with the Nintendo Entertainment System. They had done it with the Super Nintendo. They did it with the Game Boy a lot. That sort of thing is just important. But it also allows them to potentially fix things that people would complain about. But it also just allowed for experimentation, too. You talked about the DSi. That really built upon the Nintendo DS in a lot of ways They had already started to do the idea of downloadable games, but you had to go to the store and keep your system on to download from a DS that was in the store itself. DSi, you could do it from the comfort of your home because now Wi-Fi is more widely available. And it allowed them to do it in a way that was a lot more safe. It's still a DS at the end of the day. It's going to play primarily DS games, but it'll allow you to dip into some of that digital distribution, the account management, all the things that you could try to get right the first time around, or you could do these experimental releases that have a lot of consumer benefit, but also just benefit their own development process.
So I think they're really smart at making improvements while still keeping the compatibility with all the games and everything.
In the US, for example, the DSi sold more than 1.7 million consoles in its first 3 months, managing to beat out the original DS, DS Lite, and even the Wii, at least according to Denise Kegler, NOA's vice president of corporate affairs at the time. In the IGN article where she boldly pushes back against the notion the DSi had a slow release, she name-dropped multiple games still yet to come to the system, including Mario & Luigi, Bowser's Inside Story, The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks, and a few more. The biggest change for the DSi was, of course, its inclusion of downloadable content in the form of DSiWare. Using a Wi-Fi connection, DSi owners could access the DSi Shop, an early version of Nintendo's eShop service. Most DSiWare games were known as smaller, stripped-down versions of other games, but with games like Shantae, Risky's Revenge, and Cave Story becoming critical and commercial successes, each getting more releases once new systems came out. Software released via the DSi Shop were essential to many DSi owners, including free software like Flipnote Studio, which opened the door for many users to get into animation as a creative outlet. Software like Flipnote Studio, Nintendogs, Brain Age, Big Brain Academy, Pokemon, Mario Kart, Animal Crossing, New Super Mario Bros., and more helped open up the DS as a console anybody could get on and play. Games such as Mario & Luigi, Dragon Quest, Zelda, Professor Layton, Phoenix Wright, Metroid Prime Hunters, Mario 64 DS, and many, many more helped solidify this fact by bringing more hardcore titles to the system. With all of the different types of games, applications, and everything in between, the DS family had, by the end of its life cycle, truly began Nintendo's takeover. And if you ask anyone who owned a DS what their favorite game is, they're likely to have a different answer than what you may have in your head.
One of my favorite games is a Japanese-only game, and it's the Band Brothers game for the DS. Looks like that. And it's a musical game. It's a rhythm game. Guitar Hero would become popular around that time, but now we had it on our handheld, and it was done in a way that it was easy to get into. It was easy to start to play this game, but it was actually quite difficult because you were playing almost every single note versus the Guitar Hero, which tried to simplify things. It meant that you're holding the DS in some really weird ways, trying to hold the L and the R buttons in different combinations, and it really is not super comfortable to play, especially as I've gotten older. But it's the sort of game that you can just come back to. You can pick it up, you can play a few songs, put it down, come back next week, next month, next year, and you always feel like you're doing something. And I also think from a technology point of view, it was an interesting game because they released an expansion pack for it that you had to plug in the GBA port, so you'd have both cartridges in the DS at the same time to unlock more songs. I think that's something that was very rarely used for the DS, but something that I wish more companies had done, because I would have kept buying songs for it. So I love that game.
Mario Kart for DS. So I remember me and my wife, we were on vacation. We had our own DSs. She didn't have a copy of Mario Kart. I did. And we were able to play together using the wireless transmissions between just the DSs. Having that and being able to play multiplayer in such a way is just so fantastic. I love it.
While Nintendo may have started out as a card company way back in 1889, One of the reasons I think they've made it this far is because they continue to find and encourage leaders who focus on how to make their products fun. From the time in which they started producing video games, something they focused on more than any other company was how to make their games fun, like the toys that they made. With the Game & Watch originally intended to allow anyone to play a small game on the go, Satoru Iwata, Reggie Fils-Aimé, Satoru Okada, the entire team behind the DS, and all of the individuals who came before continued that idea and pushed Nintendo's brand even further, allowing and encouraging anyone to play.
I think Nintendo has always been focused on play rather than performance. The way the DS just held itself up in enabling fun play, Nintendogs, Mario Kart, and all the other fantastic titles on in the DS library. The focus that they had on making the games really fun and making a good use of the two screens made it so much better than I could possibly imagine. Nintendo always focuses on the play aspect. They want it to be fun. They want it to be tactile. Tactility has been really a key thing for the DS, the Wii, the Wii U, and the Switch. For them to come out with a new handheld that has not just one, but two screens, and asking every developer for that system to create new games that utilizes two screens is a big ask. But they did it, and I think they just nailed it.
The Nintendo DS is well known for familiarizing the public with a touchscreen before the release of the iPhone, allowing people from across the globe to connect to the device in the palm of their hands, creating a brand new marketing scheme in the form of touch generations, allowing kids to create animations with a few swipes of their stylus in Flipnote Studio, and it opened the door for Nintendo to continue pushing the definition of play, creating new ways for developers to create and new ways for players to engage.
The Nintendo DS really expanded the pool of gamers that were out there. When you look at the many hundreds of releases for the DS, there is something for everybody. You could play a casual game like Nintendogs. You could play the Nintendo classics like Mario Kart or Mario Party, which for my money are some of the best versions of those games. But then you had a lot of experimental things. You had horror games. Resident Evil was released for the DS. There were just so many opportunities for so many people. The hardware was reasonably priced. Lots of games available. It's hard to understate how important it is to find a game you like. And with Nintendo DS, there was a game for everybody.
With this, they had an entirely different segment of games. No other console, handheld or otherwise, could run these games.
By the end of its life cycle, the Nintendo DS ended up selling 154.02 million units, making it the best-selling handheld and second best-selling console, at least until the Switch overtakes it. With a storied library of games, a laundry list of accessories, but most importantly, a near infinite amount of ways to play, the DS continues to stand the test of time.
The DS came out when I was a junior in high school. I had my first job, so I was able to just go buy it and not worry about asking mom for money. But then the memories that would come from bringing the system just about everywhere. So many people had a DS, and you could play multiplayer off of one cartridge for many of them. It was easy to boot up Mario Kart DS. I can remember waiting online for the Wii, both for the pre-order process and for picking up the system itself, waiting and just playing Mario Kart DS, Tetris DS with a bunch of strangers that I couldn't tell you who they were, don't know where they came from, but we all were able to bond over that.
Whenever I see a Nintendo DS, I remember all the time that I have spent playing that specific console. I remember how it feels like, what it was like when I played it, where I was, because I don't need to be in my basement like I am right now to play video games. I can be anywhere. I can be on the road. I can be flying. I can be on the train. I can be at my parents'. I can be anywhere and still enjoy the games. And I think that's the most important thing about this console, and the most important thing about many handhelds, obviously. But I think this handheld has a really... I have a very fond memory of playing so many great games on the road with this.
As the Nintendo DS recently turned 20, I and many others continue to talk about the legacy that it has. The younger brother to the Game Boy Advance, and by extension the Game Boy itself, had a simple premise, but also had the largest shoes to fill in the gaming landscape. Going from the big screen to the palm of your hands can help elevate the fact that gaming is meant to be entertainment. There are many facets of handheld gaming, but the legacy that the DS left behind is a large one. It wasn't about graphics or resolution, microtransactions, or constant online connection. It wasn't even about the games themselves. It's about hiding it under your pillow when your mom comes in. It's sending silly messages in PictoChat. It's sharing a game of Mario Kart DS with your wife. It's being surrounded by your friends. It's spreading rumors about that legendary Pokemon. It's nostalgic. It's childlike. It's entertainment. It's fun. It's about play, and how you choose to engage with the DS was likely different than how your neighbor, your best friend, and your spouse chose to engage with it. The DS itself truly became the world you wish for, and was the beginning of the Nintendo Revolution.